Staff Sergeant Derek Loomis dropped her maintenance report on the floor in front of everyone. Not accidentally. He looked right at her when he did it, let it fall from his hand like it was something he'd found stuck to his boot, and said, loud enough for the whole motor pool to hear, "Someone want to explain to me why there's a marksmanship evaluation request on my desk from a supply clerk?" The hangar went quiet the way hangars go quiet when something ugly happens in public, and everyone is deciding whether to pretend they didn't see it. Sergeant First Class Danielle Marsh picked the report up off the concrete floor. She didn't look at Loomis when she did it. She didn't look at the 12 other soldiers who had stopped what they were doing to watch. She just bent down, picked it up, smoothed the corner that had folded on impact, and set it on the workbench beside her. Then she went back to the weapons inspection she'd been running before he interrupted it. That silence, that one moment of absolute stillness from a woman who had every reason in the world to respond, was the beginning of something that none of them would understand until it was over. Forward Operating Base Kamdesh sat in a valley that the mountains didn't so much surround as swallow. The peaks came up on every side like walls someone had built too high to see over. And in November, the wind that moved through them had the particular quality of cold that isn't just temperature but intention, as if the altitude itself had decided that human beings had no business being there and was doing its level best to communicate that. The unit stationed at Kamdesh was the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and the men who made up its forward element were not people who used that fact lightly. They had earned what they were, through years of selection and training and deployments that had gone badly in ways that the official after-action reports never quite captured, and they carried that history in the way they moved, in the economy of their speech, in the particular stillness of people who have learned that most situations do not require a reaction, and the ones that do require a very specific kind. Master Sergeant Ray Talbot had 17 years in the regiment. Captain Stephen Hale had planned and executed direct action missions in 3 countries he was not permitted to name in any open document. Warrant Officer Marcus Deng had survived 2 helicopter crashes and the subsequent firefights that followed both of them, which his company commander had later described, in private, as the kind of luck that only happens to people who are also very, very good. These were men who respected competence above almost everything else. They would tell you that, and they would mean it in the way that people mean things that are mostly true. Which is why what happened when Sergeant First Class Danielle Marsh arrived at Kamdesh from her previous posting at Bagram was both entirely predictable and entirely unjustifiable. She had come in on a resupply flight, no ceremony, no introduction beyond the standard personnel manifest. She was 31 years old, medium height, with the particular economy of movement that comes from spending years doing physical work that requires precision. She wore no visible decoration on her patrol uniform, carried a single kit bag, and asked the soldier who met her at the pad where the armory was before she asked where she was sleeping. The soldier, a specialist named Torres, told her later that he hadn't thought much of that. People asked all kinds of things when they landed at a new posting. He showed her the armory. He showed her the barracks. He went back to his duties. The commentary started 20 minutes later, after word had moved through the base in the way. Word always moves through a small forward operating base, immediately, completely, and without any particular accuracy. Supply transfer. Why are they sending us supply? She's not supply. She's attached from Battalion S4. Administrative support, somebody said. They send us an admin sergeant? What does battalion think we need? Better filing. It found Loomis within the hour. Loomis, who ran the motor pool and the weapons maintenance schedule, and had very strong opinions about both, and who had the particular talent of some men for turning private skepticism into public performance. He found the marksmanship evaluation request on his desk. The next morning, Marsh's name at the top, requesting range time and a qualification evaluation at extended distance. He dropped it on the floor in front of everyone. She picked it up. She went back to work. The thing about Danielle Marsh that nobody at Kamdesh knew, because nobody had thought to read past the first page of her file, was that the first page of her file was not the interesting part. The interesting part was on pages 4 through 9, which were marked with a classification level that the base's admin clerk, who processed incoming personnel files, had looked at once and then quietly set aside because verifying that level of clearance was above his pay grade, and he wasn't sure who to ask, so the file sat, and Marsh ran weapons maintenance checks on equipment that did not belong to her assignment and said nothing about it. Talbot found her in the armory on her third day. He was not a man who did things without reason, and his reason for finding her was that Torres had mentioned, in passing, that the new sergeant had spent 4 hours the previous evening cleaning and inspecting rifles that weren't hers to clean, and had found 3 that were out of spec in ways that the unit's own maintenance log had missed. He watched her for a moment before he said anything. She was working on a scope mount, making small adjustments with the particular concentration of someone who was not thinking about being watched. "Marsh," he said. She looked up. "Who authorized your access to this armory?" "Captain Hale," she said. "I put in the request on day 1. Talbot had not known that. He made a note to ask Hale about it later. "Those rifles are flagged as mission ready." "2 of them aren't," she said. "The elevation adjustment on the ACOG is drifting. 3rd one has a loose barrel nut. Not dangerous, but not accurate past 200 meters. Talbot looked at the rifles in question. He picked up the one she'd indicated and checked the barrel himself. The way someone checks a thing they don't entirely believe, and the way someone looks when the thing turns out to be true. He set it down. "How long have you been doing maintenance work?" "That's not my primary background," she said. "What is?" She looked at him steadily. "That information is in my file." "Your file," Talbot said, "is classified above my current verification access." "I know," she said. "You can request clearance through Colonel Darby at Battalion. He's expecting the inquiry." Talbot stared at her for a long moment. He was trying to read something in her face that would tell him whether this was confidence or performance. And the problem was that he couldn't find either one. What he found instead was the expression of someone stating a fact about weather or terrain, something that simply was, without investment in his reaction to it. "Keep working," he said, and left to make a phone call. Whatever Colonel Darby told him, it changed the set of his shoulders for the rest of the day. The qualification range at Kamdesh was a cleared strip along the eastern edge of the base, targets set at standard intervals, a spotting position at the far end. It was used twice a week by the unit's designated marksmen, and occasionally by operators wanting to maintain their qualifications. Marsh had requested evaluation at distances up to 800 meters. The request, after Loomis had dropped it on the floor and she had picked it up and resubmitted it through Hale's office, had been approved with a quiet note from Hale that said only, "Accommodate." 23 men showed up to watch. This was not coincidental. The word had moved again, as it always did, and this time it had carried with it a specific quality of anticipation that had nothing to do with expecting her to succeed. Loomis was there. He had brought coffee. He gave some to the man next to him and made a comment that made 2 people laugh and 1 person look away. Deng was there too. He had not made a comment. He had come because he had been in enough situations to know that sometimes the person the room had already decided about was the most important thing in the room, and he had learned not to miss those moments. Marsh arrived at the range alone, carrying a rifle case that nobody recognized. It was a long case, unmarked, with the kind of handling wear that comes from actual use rather than storage. She set it on the bench and opened it, and the rifle inside was not standard issue anything. Several of the more experienced operators recognized it as a custom long-range platform, the kind that ended up with people who needed to make shots that standard equipment couldn't support. The commentary moved through the crowd at a lower register now, less certain than it had been. She settled behind the rifle, made scope adjustments, checked the wind indicators, ran a sequence of observations that were clearly a system of some kind, practiced and internal, the visible portion of a larger invisible process. Then she went still. The first shot was at 400 meters, and it hit center mass. Nobody reacted. That was expected. The second shot was at 600 meters, and it hit center mass. The spotter, a young corporal named Ibanez, who had been given this assignment and was taking it seriously, reported, "Hit 6 o'clock from center, roughly 2 centimeters. She made 1 small adjustment to the scope. It took 4 seconds. Third shot, 600 meters. Ibanez was quiet for a moment longer than he needed to be. Then, dead center. Not the same hole as the first round. Close enough that Ibanez felt the need to add. Wind shifted between shots. She held for it. The quality of the crowd's silence changed. Not dramatically. Not with the obvious electric quality of shock. It changed the way light changes when clouds move. Subtly, completely without announcement. Loomis was still holding his coffee. He had stopped drinking it. She moved to the 800-meter target without being asked, without looking at the crowd, without any apparent awareness of the shift that had just occurred in the atmosphere around her. She watched the range flags for a long moment. The wind was inconsistent, the gusts arriving at irregular intervals in the way mountain wind does, refusing to settle into a pattern that could be easily calculated. She waited. Nobody rushed her. Nobody said anything. Then she fired. Ibanez took longer this time. When he came back on the radio, his voice was different from how it had started. Not dramatically different, just slightly more careful. Hit, center mass. He paused. Sir, he said, addressing Talbot, who had come to stand at the back of the group sometime in the last 10 minutes. I'm reading a grouping here that I'd like you to verify because I want to make sure I'm seeing it correctly. Talbot walked to the spotting scope. He looked through it for what felt like a long time. When he stepped back, his face was the face of a man who has just learned something that reorganizes a prior assumption and who is deciding how to carry the new information in the presence of people who still hold the old one. 3 rounds, he said to the group. Near identical grouping. 800 meters in that wind. Deng, standing to Talbot's left, exhaled slowly through his nose. It was not a sound of relief or surprise. It was the sound of a man who had suspected something and had just been confirmed. Loomis set his coffee down on the sandbag wall beside him. He didn't say anything. She didn't move from the bench. She wasn't looking at them. She was already looking at the 1,000-meter marker, where no target had been set because nobody had thought they'd need one. Talbot looked at the range layout. Then he looked at her. Ibanez, he said, set a target at 1,000. What happened at 1,000 meters in a wind that had shifted twice in the time it took Ibanez to set the target and return to his position would be described differently by different people in the days that followed, depending on what they'd been willing to believe beforehand. But the number they all agreed on was 3, and the grouping they all agreed on was tight enough that Ibanez took a photograph with his personal phone because he wanted to be able to show it to people later and have evidence that he wasn't exaggerating. Loomis left the range before it was over, not angrily, not with a comment. He just picked up his coffee, found that it had gone cold, set it back down, and walked toward the motor pool. 2 men near him watched him go and then looked at each other and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. That night, Talbot sat in the operations office for 2 hours with a phone in Marsh's file, working through the clearance authorization that Colonel Darby had set up. He read what he was permitted to read and was read the portions he didn't have access to by a voice on the other end of a secure line that delivered information in the clipped, precise cadence of someone who had said these things before and understood what they meant. He sat with the phone after the call ended. He looked at the wall. What he had been told did not match the woman who had arrived on a resupply flight with a single kit and spent her first evening cleaning other people's rifles. It matched something else entirely, a record of deployments that appeared in the file as dates and code designations, a series of outcomes that the missions had achieved without the official record, explaining how they had been achieved, and a number, 9, that referred to operations in which a specific resource had been deployed, and the mission outcome had been, in each case, the one that was needed. 9 operations, in 7 years, in 5 countries, with a designation in the file instead of a name. Talbot understood the designation system. He had encountered it once before in a briefing 3 years ago, attached to an operation in which 2 teams had been extracted from a situation that the official report described as resolved by coordinated action without specifying whose action or how. He had wondered at the time. He had not asked, because some questions in this work are not asked unless the answer is being offered. He was not sure, sitting in that office with the phone in his hand, whether he was angry about that or simply in the particular state that comes when you realize you have been inside a story longer than you knew. The mission briefing happened 4 days later. It was called for reasons that had nothing to do with Marsh. A situation had developed 60 kilometers north that required a response, a compound that intelligence had identified as a logistics hub for a network responsible for 3 recent attacks on coalition supply routes, guarded by people who had demonstrated both capability and willingness. Captain Hale ran the briefing. He laid out the compound's position, the terrain approaches, the guard patterns that reconnaissance had established. He explained the problem. The problem was the eastern ridge. The compound sat in a natural depression, and the one viable approach for an assault team came from the southwest, through a draw that was covered from a guard position on the eastern ridge line. Any team moving through that draw would be visible and exposed for approximately 4 minutes. The ridgeline position would need to be neutralized or suppressed before the assault element moved. The ridgeline position was 1,100 meters from the compound, and the ridgeline itself, the point from which Overwatch could cover the assault team's approach, was 1,200 meters from the guard position that needed to be addressed. 1,200 meters. In mountain terrain. At night. With the elevation differential that the map showed, roughly 200 meters of drop from the Overwatch position to the target. We need a long-range precision element on that ridge before the assault team moves, Hale said. He looked at the men in the room. The unit had 2 trained designated marksmen. Their confirmed ranges were 700 meters and 800 meters respectively. The room understood the math without being told. It was Deng who said it, not as a challenge, just as the observation of someone working the problem. That's outside our current capability. There was a pause. From the back of the room, a single sentence. It isn't. 20 people turned. Marsh was sitting in the last row, where she had come in quietly after the briefing started, carrying a notebook, taking the kind of notes that people take when they are already 2 steps into solving a problem the room is still identifying. She was not looking at the map. She was looking at Hale. With respect, said Staff Sergeant Loomis, who had come back from the range 4 days ago and not quite returned to where he'd been before it. 1,200 meters at night with elevation differential is what I'll need to calculate for, she said. The elevation component is manageable. The night condition is actually favorable at that distance because the thermal differential improves the atmospheric density. The main variable is the wind pattern on that specific ridgeline, and I'd need the meteorological data for the last 2 weeks to project it. The room was quiet. Hale looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had read a file partially and was now watching the file demonstrate itself in real time and finding the demonstration consistent with what he had read. That data is available, he said. Marsh, you'll have it within the hour. Loomis sat very still. He was not the same person who had dropped the report on the floor. He was not yet sure who he was instead, but he was working on it. She spent the next 6 hours doing things that most of the base didn't understand and wasn't meant to understand. She worked with the meteorological data and with topographic maps, and with a small notebook she filled with calculations that Deng, who had a background in applied mathematics before the Army had redirected him, looked at once over her shoulder and then looked away from without comment, because the comment that came to him was not one he was ready to say out loud. The mission went at 0200. She was on the ridgeline at 0115 45 minutes before the assault element moved to their staging position, which was 45 minutes more than she had said she needed and 20 minutes more than Talbot had asked for. She had said nothing about the extra time. She had simply been there. Her support for the ridgeline approach was a single ranger, Specialist Kamani, 23 years old, who had been selected for the task because he was quiet and fast and had the judgment not to ask questions when questions would slow something down. He carried her secondary equipment to the ridgeline base and left her there and went to the extraction point and waited, listening on his radio. At 0148, her voice came over the encrypted command channel. It was identical in cadence and registered to every other transmission she had made in the 4 days since her arrival. Unhurried, precise, entirely without performance. Overwatch actual, position established, sightlines confirmed. I have the guard position. Wind is variable, gusting northeast at intervals of approximately 90 seconds. I'll work in the troughs. Ready when you are. In the assault staging area, Deng pressed his earpiece and exhaled slowly. The assault team moved at 0152. What happened in the next 22 minutes would be written into the official after-action report in the way that things get written when they go well. Clearly, chronologically, with the specific grammar of outcomes that were achieved. The guard position was neutralized at 0156. The approach draw was cleared. The assault team reached the compound outer wall at 0203 without taking contact, which was the intended outcome and the one that a particular woman on a ridgeline 1,200 meters away had made possible with 2 rounds in the dark, in a wind that was doing what mountain wind always does, which is refuse to cooperate. There were 2 additional engagements during the breach that were not in the original plan. A secondary guard post that intelligence had not identified, active, a threat to the assault team's left flank. She called it 15 seconds before anyone on the ground saw it, identified the threat level, and addressed it in the time it would have taken the team to react. Deng, inside the compound by then, heard her transmission and moved a fraction of a second faster than he might have otherwise. He would think about that fraction of a second later, lying on his bunk, in the particular way that soldiers think about the distances between outcomes. The second additional engagement was a vehicle that came out of a structure on the northern side of the compound 14 minutes into the breach, moving fast toward the road that led to the valley's northern exit. In the vehicle was the person the intelligence had identified as the network's regional coordinator, a man whose departure from the area would mean restarting an intelligence process that had taken 11 months to develop. Hale, in the command element a kilometer from the compound, saw it on the drone feed and had 8 seconds to make a decision. Overwatch, I have a vehicle exiting north. Target individual confirmed rear passenger. Can you give me a call? Her response was immediate. Vehicle is at 900 meters from my position and moving. Road runs straight for approximately 300 meters before the curve. I need the vehicle in that straight section. Authorization? Hale authorized. The vehicle entered the straight section. The shot traveled 900 meters through cold mountain air and arrived before the sound did. The vehicle stopped. In the staging area, Kamani, listening on his radio, sat down on a rock and looked at the mountains and did not say anything for a long time. She was at the extraction point at 0229. The support helicopter was 2 minutes out. She had packed her equipment, moved down the ridgeline alone in the dark, and arrived at the exact coordinates she had given before the mission began, at the exact time she had estimated. Kamani was there waiting. He had been there for 40 minutes. He looked at her when she arrived, and he thought about all the things he had heard on the radio in the past hour, and he said, I had the easy job tonight. She looked at him. You carried 50 pounds of equipment up 300 meters of elevation in the dark without making noise. That's not easy. Still, he said. Still, she agreed. The helicopter came in low and they boarded it, and in 18 minutes they were back at Kamdesh. And the first person Marsh saw when she stepped off was Loomis. He was not there by accident. He had been awake, listening to the operation on the command net with the rest of the personnel who had roles adjacent to the mission, and when the last transmission had come through, and the outcome was clear, he had put on his jacket and walked to the landing pad and stood there in the cold for 17 minutes, waiting for the helicopter that was bringing her back. He was not a man who rehearsed things. He had never been good at it. So what he said when she stepped off the helicopter and walked toward him was not polished and was not what he had intended, but was exactly true. I owe you an apology, he said, for the report, for dropping it, for everything I said in front of people. She stopped. She looked at him. Marsh, he said, because he had learned her name was not a rank and a gender, and whatever he had decided she was in the first 30 seconds. Her name was Marsh, and she was someone who had just done something on a ridgeline in the dark that he did not have the technical vocabulary to fully describe, and he had started in the past 7 days to understand what it had cost her to be here without anyone knowing that. I was wrong. Not just about the report, about how I think. I formed a judgment before I had one piece of evidence, and I made that judgment public, and I am asking you to let me say so directly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, okay, he nodded. Okay, she said again, and she meant it, and she walked past him toward the debrief. Loomis stood on the landing pad in the cold and thought about the distance between who he had been at the start of the week and who he was choosing to be at the end of it. And he found that the distance was not comfortable, but was necessary and was real. The debrief was 26 people in a room that smelled like cold coffee and the particular exhaustion that follows a night when things went the way they were supposed to go because of things that were very nearly not survivable. Hale ran it chronologically. He got to the Overwatch element and he turned to the back of the room. Marsh gave her account the way she did everything, sequentially, precisely, without ornamentation. She gave them the wind data as she had read it in real time. The adjustments she had made between the initial assessment and the actual shot, the timing of the gusts, and how she had worked within the intervals. She described the vehicle engagement in the same register as everything else, as a problem that had presented itself and been solved. When she finished, Deng said from his seat at the middle of the table, the secondary guard post. You called it before any of us had visual. I had the elevated angle, she said. I could see the edge of the structure you were approaching from. The way the guard positioned himself in relation to the wall was inconsistent with a standard observation post. He was angled to engage, not to watch. Deng looked at her for a long moment. How long did it take you to identify that? The position change that told me was about 4 seconds. 4 seconds, Deng said, not as a challenge. As someone processing a specific truth about how much can happen in 4 seconds and how often the 4 seconds is where everything is decided. Hale set his notebook down. He looked around the room, and then he looked at her. And when he spoke with the deliberateness of a man choosing words that will be on record. I'm putting your full name and your full account in this after-action report. I'm also submitting a formal commendation up the chain that includes your engagement record from tonight and the record from your previous deployments to the extent I have access to it. He paused. I'm aware that access is limited. I'm requesting expanded clearance. Whatever comes back, the submission goes up with my name on it. The room was completely still. Marsh looked at Hale. Something moved in her face that was not relief and was not surprise and was not the satisfaction of being proven right, because she had never been doing this to be proven right. It was something more complicated and more quiet than any of those things. The expression of a person who has carried something alone for long enough that having someone else acknowledge the weight of it is a different kind of experience than she had allowed herself to expect. They may redact it, she said. They may, he said. I'll still put it there. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way you nod when something real has been offered and you want the other person to know you understand it is real. The room began to disperse. People stood and stretched and moved toward the door with the particular heaviness of people who have been awake since before midnight and are now being asked to come back to the ordinary world. Talbot found her in the hallway. How long? He said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood the question. Not how long have you been shooting, not how long have you been in the army, but how long have you been doing this specific thing, in this specific way, alone? 7 years, she said. Talbot absorbed that. He looked at the floor and then back at her. 9 operation, 9 completed deployments, she said. There were others I wasn't assigned to, ones where the outcome was different. He understood what she meant, the ones where she hadn't been there. The ones where the thing that needed to be done hadn't been done, because someone in a position to deploy her had chosen not to for reasons that had nothing to do with capability. That's wrong, he said. Yes, she said, it is. They stood in the hallway for a moment. Danielle, he said, not Marsh, not Sergeant, her name. She looked at him. What you did out there tonight, he said. I want you to know that the people in that room know exactly what it was. Not the report, not the commendation, the people. She was quiet. It matters, he said, what people know, even when it isn't written down. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted slightly, the way something shifts when a person who has spent years armoring a specific part of themselves allows something through that armor that they had not planned to allow. I know, she said, and then, thank you for saying it. She went to her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bunk, and she looked at her hands in the dark for a while, not in distress. In the particular way that people process large things by sitting very still and letting the weight of them settle into the body rather than holding them at arm's length. 9 operations, 7 years. A designation instead of a name in a file that most people didn't have the clearance to read. And tonight, for the first time, her name in a room where the people who had benefited from her work were the ones saying it. She lay back on the bunk without taking her jacket off and was asleep before the next hour turned. At 0900, Kamani knocked on the door of the common area where Loomis and Torres and Deng and 3 others had gathered around a table with coffee that had been hot 20 minutes ago. He sat down. He said, I carried her equipment to the ridgeline. That's all I did. And then I sat at the extraction point for 40 minutes listening to the operation on my radio. He looked at the table. She was completely alone up there, the whole time, every transmission, every shot, completely alone. Deng said nothing. He had known this. Knowing it once in a briefing was different from hearing it described by the person who had watched her walk up alone in the dark. How does a person do that? Kamani said. Not rhetorically. The genuine question of someone who had just encountered a thing he had no existing category for. Loomis, who had been quiet since he came in and sat down with people he had worked beside for 2 years and was still sorting through what he owed them by way of example, said, I don't know. But I think it starts with the room deciding they already know who she is, and her deciding that what the room thinks is not the problem she needs to solve. Torres looked at him. I dropped her report on the floor, Loomis said. To the room, not to any one person. In front of everyone. Day 3, and she picked it up and went back to work. He looked at his coffee. That's not nothing. What that cost her to do that is not nothing. And I have been thinking about it for a week, and I have not yet figured out how to account for it in a way that is proportionate. The table was quiet. You start, Deng said. That's all. You just start. 3 days later, Marsh was sitting at the workbench in the armory, doing post-deployment maintenance on her rifle, when Hale came in and sat across from her and told her about the response to his commendation submission. The operational details had been reclassified. Her name was attached to a formal commendation that would exist in a file. She would never be permitted to show anyone outside a classified setting. The 9 previous operations remained classified at their original level. But there was a training mandate, a program that had been authorized at a level above the battalion, designating a formal role for her as the lead instructor for a precision marksmanship and field adaptation course, the first of its kind to be officially acknowledged rather than embedded within classified operations. The role was on record. Her name in that role was on record. The program itself was on record. It's not what you're owed, Hale said. No, she said. It's more than there was. She looked at the disassembled rifle in front of her, at the parts laid out in the order she always laid them, the order that matched the sequence of the work, nothing out of place and nothing absent. The people I train, she said, they'll know the full scope of it, what the work actually requires. Not just technically, that's your call to make, Hale said. She nodded. Something was working behind her eyes that was not calculation, or not the kind of calculation she applied to wind and distance. It was the longer kind, the kind that involves the years ahead and the people in them and what it means to change something from the inside. Then yes, she said, they'll know everything I can tell them, and I'll find a way to tell them the rest. Hale looked at her for a moment. I'm glad you were here, he said, and he meant something beyond the mission, beyond the outcome, beyond the commendation he had submitted and the program he had helped authorize. He meant that the base had needed to encounter her, that the people on it had needed to be wrong in the specific way they had been wrong, and to find out they were wrong in the specific way they had found out, because some things only teach themselves through contact with reality, and the reality in this case had arrived in a single kit bag on a resupply flight and had been patient enough to wait for the room to catch up. She said, I think I needed to be here too, more than I expected. And she meant it. On the morning she left, the helicopter was scheduled for 0630. She came through the door of the accommodation block at 061 with her rifle case over one shoulder and her kit bag over the other. She walked toward the gate with the same walk she'd had when she arrived, unhurried and direct, and already pointed toward whatever came next. At the gate, there were people, not ordered there, not assembled by rank or protocol, standing there in the early cold because they had talked about it, some of them the night before over coffee that went cold, and had decided it was the thing to do. Talbot was there, Hale was there, Deng and Torres and Kimani, who had carried her kit and waited for 40 minutes and would carry both of those experiences with him for the rest of his career. Loomis was there, standing slightly apart from the others, in the particular posture of a man who is still learning where he fits in a story he arrived late to. Hale stepped forward when she reached the gate. He raised his hand, she returned the salute, and then, without being asked, without coordination, without ceremony, every person standing at that gate raised their hand in the cold morning air of a forward operating base in a mountain valley in Afghanistan and held it until she lowered hers. Loomis held his a beat longer than the others, not for effect, because he had something to finish saying that he hadn't found words for yet, and the salute was the closest he could get. She picked up her bags. She walked through the gate. She didn't look back. Behind her, Kamani said quietly, not to anyone in particular. She knew my name when we met. Before I introduced myself, she said, "You must be Kimani," and she'd looked at my file, the whole file, before she even landed. Loomis, standing beside him, said nothing for a long moment. Then she took us seriously before we gave her any reason to. Kimani looked at him. Yeah, we should have done the same. The helicopter rose over the eastern wall and banked into the mountains, and the men standing at the gate watched it go until it was gone, and the sound was gone, and the sky was the particular pale color of early winter morning that comes after cold and before warmth, and doesn't commit to either. Talbot stayed at the gate after the others had gone back to their duties. He was thinking about a file with a designation instead of a name. He was thinking about 9 operations in 7 years and what it takes from a person to be the reason things work out, repeatedly, without ever being the reason officially. He was thinking about what it costs a system to hide the people it most needs. And he was thinking about what changes when someone finally decides to stop looking away from the cost. The morning came up over the mountains the way it always did, indifferent and steady and real. And at Kamdesh, from that day forward, the first thing anyone did with a new personnel file was read all of it.